Robert, I have been wanting to talk with you about the Sirius Mystery, and then having seen your works, The Oracles of the Dead. This is just going to be a 2-for-1 night for me personally, so I'm glad we've got you on the program. Tell me a little bit more about you beyond just what I read.
Well, I'm originally American, but I've lived in England most of my life. I grew up in Kentucky, so I'm a sort of hick, you could say, in which I take great pride because I think hicks are very good, being one. I'd have to think that. And I had a very nice time growing up surrounded by such a beautiful place as the state of Kentucky. So that's my plug for Kentucky.
The bluegrass land, huh?
Yes, it's not blue, but it's beautiful.
Now, you are where right now as we speak to you?
I'm sitting in London, which is a place where I spend a great deal of time because I live in England.
The Sirius Mystery, a tremendous story of the tribe in West Africa. How did you come upon that story to the point where you did so much research? And I've got to tell everybody, when you get a chance to read the works of Robert Temple, he not only writes it from the perspective of a researcher and author, but he actually visits and lives part of the stories that you see. And I'll talk about that when we talk about oracles, because he went on some trips that I would never go on because they would scare me to death. But how did you come across the and am I pronouncing this tribe right, the Dogon tribe? Do they pronounce it like that?
Dogon.
Dogon, okay. Tell me about this story and how you became familiar with it.
Well, it was all an accident, but due to the fact that I don't like loose ends, and if something doesn't quite fit, I never give up trying to figure out what might be wrong. Somebody said something to me that was a bit off one day, and I said, hold on, that can't be true. And I began to look into it, and it resulted in that book. In fact, what happened was I was an undergraduate at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia, where I went when I was 16 years old, and I knew a very brilliant man called Arthur Young through one of my best pals at university called John Coggeshall, and I used to call in on Arthur, who had a house in Philadelphia, and he was at a phase of his life then when he was sitting around reading every book he could find about African tribal mythologies. And I used to tease him a bit about that. And so one day he said, I've been reading a really interesting one this time. It's a tribe who live in a country called Mali in West Africa, and they're called the Dogon. Well, in fact, he said the Dogon tribe. He made a joke about it. And I later discovered they were called the Dogon. And he said, their religion and their culture are quite different from most of the African tribes. It's based upon the star Sirius. The star Sirius, I said, come on. What do you mean their religion and their culture are based on the star Sirius? A tribe in Africa, what do they know about the star Sirius? They haven't got any telescopes there, have they? Well, of course, Sirius is a very bright star, so you don't need a telescope to see that. But he said, well, no, the strange thing is that it's not really the star Sirius that they're on about, but what they say is some sort of companion star to Sirius, which goes around it. And I knew enough astronomy to realize that there was such a thing. The astronomers call it Sirius B. In other words, the main bright star that you can see in the sky being the biggest and the brightest, they call Sirius A because it's the first.
Right.
And then the little one that you can't see, they call it Sirius B. So I said, well, Arthur, there is a Sirius B, and it is small and you can't see it as far as I know. I'll have to go check. But how could a tribe in Africa have their whole religion and culture based on anything as weird as that? Oh, I don't know, he said, and then he moved on to the next tribe. Well, I wasn't satisfied, and I started looking into this, not immediately, but a bit later on, and discovered that this was not only true, but the tribe admitted that they had never actually seen this little star because you can't see it without at least a 15-inch telescope, and of course they didn't have them. And they knew its exact orbital period. Well, they admitted that they knew the orbital period of something they couldn't see.
Amazing.
That was 9 light years away. So what's going on here? And this is how the whole thing began.
Is the tribe still in existence, Robert?
Very much so, although they're under a great deal of pressure from 2 sources. One, the government of Mali is run by very earnest Muslims, and they want the Dogon to convert to Islam. Of course, everybody's supposed to convert to Islam, so you better get ready, George. But the Dogon are being pressured to give up all these traditional beliefs, which make the Muslims who run the country very nervous, because, well, everything makes Muslims nervous that isn't in the Quran or the Hadith. So the Dogon can't really get jobs or anything like that unless they first convert and thereby give up these amazing traditions, which are the basis of my book. So, of course, that makes me very unhappy. But the other thing that's putting them under even more intense pressure is the terrible drought in the Sahel region of Africa.
Oh, yeah, my God, yes.
And there's just such a shortage of water. And since the Dogon live by growing onions, even though onions don't take a great deal of water and are quite happy in fairly dry conditions, if you haven't got any water, you haven't got any onions, and therefore you haven't got a life.
How many members of the tribe are out there, Robert? Approximately.
Well, I'm afraid I can't tell you that. That's a very interesting question, George, and you're the first person who's ever asked me that, and which goes to show how sharp you are. But it's not only the Dogon themselves that are involved in this, because there are related tribes, so you don't know quite where to draw the line. There's a tribe called the Bozo and a tribe called the Bambara, and they all also share these Sirius traditions.
Oh, now this belief system in the Sirius tradition would scan approximately how many years? Hundreds of years? Thousands of years?
Well, the Dogon and all those other tribes that I mentioned, including the extraordinary tribe called the Akan in Ghana, they are all descended from migrants who came down across the Sahara Desert from the North African regions and who intermarried with the local black population, so that now all these tribes are totally black in appearance and have a mixture of languages. That is, they speak the languages which are from black Africa, but they have sort of sub-languages and secret languages which are of other origins. It's all very complex, and the Dogon have a system of written signs, of which they have about 30,000 sort of hieroglyphic-type things. It's a very, very, very complex story, but we know that the ancestors of all these people migrated south about 700 or 800 years ago, maybe 1,000, and reached this part of West Africa and spread out through Mali and Ghana. They came from the northeast, and we know the migration route. And in the Sirius Mystery, I give the map of the migration, and all of this is reconstructed on the basis of anthropological studies and historians and real evidence. None of this is just speculation. It's all things that are known.
Now, when we get into the oracles of the dead next hour, I know for a fact that you have been tunnels in that book that we're going to talk about, so you have a definite hands-on relationship to your work. In this particular one, the Sirius Mystery, did you end up having to go there, out there in West Africa, to visit these people?
Well, no. I went to Paris to see the French anthropologists who had studied them, of course, and discussed it with them. But by the time I was involved in all of this, the informants, the elderly informants in the Dogon tribe who had given the information to the French anthropologists, which they published back in the 1950s, they were all dead.
Oh, my,
and
okay.
So I wouldn't have got very far, and the only way I could have talked to those people would have been in their own language, which I didn't know, even if they had been alive. So I relied basically on the information gathered by these French anthropologists and published in obscure anthropological journals in the 1950s, which nobody had ever noticed because I had to go dig them out. And these were all published in French, not in English. And although some of that material has now been translated into English, at the time I was working on all of this, most of it was unavailable in English. And it was quite a struggle to make head or tail of this. But these were just ordinary, everyday anthropologists who were publishing this material in the way that anthropologists do in their anthropological journals, and nobody but other anthropologists ever read it, and most of them didn't read it because anthropologists don't really read each other's articles because they all work on different tribes. And so this material was completely buried and forgotten, and I had to dig it all out, and that really wasn't easy.
Are there a number of anthropologists who believe that perhaps something extraterrestrial has happened here with this tribe, or is it just a handful of people, or maybe just you?
Well, anthropologists are very, very intensely academic people, and even though that they live with a lot of tribes in obscure localities and may have a subsistence diet and behave just like the tribes people they're studying, so that they're flexible in their living habits. But in their scholarly habits, they're very, very rigid people by and large. And so you won't find very many anthropologists who are even willing to mention the word extraterrestrial. And the reason for this is they're terribly afraid all the time of criticism by their colleagues.
Sure.
If you're in the academic world living on a campus and you want to get your promotion from assistant lecturer to full lecturer, if you want to become an assistant professor and then you want to become an associate professor and then you want to become a full professor and then you want to become a dean or a provost or something like that, you have to play the game. And if you're going to start going around talking about spacemen, you're out.
Oh, but what a theory, because this of everything that I have studied and looked at in this entire field of, the possibility of extraterrestrial life. It's your story. It's this story about the Sirius Mystery that, to me, is the most exciting of all of them. Beyond Roswell and what may have happened in 1947, the fact that this tribe in Africa has witnessed something that, as you said, you cannot see with the naked eye. And I am sure even 500 years ago or 1,000, this planet wasn't in a situation where you could still see that with the naked eye. It's impossible. Something else must have happened. They got information in some other way. Had to have.
That's why the book is called The Sirius Mystery, because it is a mystery. And I should draw the distinction between planets and stars here. The Dogon tribe know very well the difference between planets and stars, which is more than a lot of people in the street or in the mall might do, by the way.
Well, even that's amazing, isn't it? All that by itself. The fact that they would even be able to distinguish the difference or know the difference, that's pretty good.
I know. As I say, there's a lot of people walking along the street today who don't know that much. And the Dogon are very, very particular in their descriptions. They admit that they believe that beings came from the system of the star Sirius to the Earth in the distant past. That's their story, and they're sticking to it. And these are the heroic figures who founded civilization on the Earth. But they did not land in Africa. People who glance at my book often think, oh, God, Robert Temple's talking about spacemen in Africa. What next? But it's not that at all. The beings that they claim landed in the place from which their ancestors came. They didn't land in Mali. So that's very important. Now, the information says that they came from a planet that orbited a star. They didn't live on a star. That's not possible. You'd get burned up in a split second, wouldn't you? So the system of the star Sirius, according to the Dogon, consists of 3 stars. There's the little one I mentioned, Sirius B, and then they said there was this third one, which according to their descriptions would be a red dwarf, as the astronomers call them. And so I made the prediction back in the 1970s when the original edition of the Sirius Mystery was published, which was 1976. I said that astronomers one day, in my opinion, will confirm the information given by the Dogon tribe that there is a third star in that system which will be discovered to be a red dwarf. And in 1995, it was confirmed in the journal Astronomy and Astrophysics by two French astronomers, radio astronomers, called Benet and Dogon. They published an article in 1995 after spending many years studying the perturbations of the stars in the Sirius system, which means a little bit of jiggling due to gravitational effects. They discovered this third star, and they said that, and they described it. And of course, from their description, we're talking about a red dwarf. So my prediction 20 years later was verified. And when that happened, I decided to reissue the Sirius Mystery in a revised edition, which came out in 1998, which contains 50% more material. And you can buy this book from Inner Traditions, my American publisher. Yay, Inner Traditions. Inner Traditions, everybody. And they also published the other book that you mentioned.
Robert, we'll be back. We'll be back in a moment. Just hold on. We'll be right back with our special guest tonight, Robert Temple. We're going to continue talking about the Sirius Mystery because it is an incredible story. I'm George Norrie. Oh, by the way, his website is linked up at coasttocoastam.com, but it's robert-temple.com. We'll be right back. I'm getting some fastballs from people who are having some internet slowdown, so maybe it's affecting you too. It's probably one of those things going worldwide. You know, they were warning about some possible problems with the internet coming up, so maybe this is it. In a moment, we'll be back with Robert Temple. We'll continue to chat with him about this incredible story called the Sirius Mystery. Next hour, we'll talk about oracles of the dead, ancient techniques for predicting the future. All of that in a moment on Coast to Coast AM. Robert Temple, our guest. Robert, the ancestors of the Dogon tribe, where did they come from then?
Well, the Dogon say they came from up north, and we know that they came across the Sahara. And so I set about a very lengthy research process to find out who the hell were these ancestors and where did they come from, just as you've asked. And I managed to trace most of the bits and pieces and details of the Dogon information to ancient Egypt form. In other words, the Dogon gave the anthropologists a very coherent and consistent account of all the details of what they were talking about, including the orbital period and all of that. And I found most of this information, a little bit here, a little bit there, in fragmentary form, was in existence in ancient Egypt. And so what seems to have happened is this, that at some time a group of religious zealots were driven out of Egypt whose chief god was Amun, and they made their way, first of all, to the oasis of Siwa, which is on the Egyptian-Libyan border. And then they were driven into Libya, where they became known at the time of the ancient Greek historian Herodotus as the Garamantes tribe. And they were driving around in chariots and were quite fierce warriors. And then they were driven further and further west and further south, and they went from oasis to oasis and finally migrated down into Africa and intermingled with the locals, but they kept these traditions. Now, the god of the Dogon tribe is called Amma, A-M-M-A, Amma, which is basically the same as Amun or Amun.
Mm-hmm. Sure is.
And that's the name of their god today. And so they seem to have been a group who were religious purists of a priestly nature who believed that only by leaving Egypt at some moment of crisis, which can't have been later than the New Kingdom and may well have been earlier, we don't know, They thought that they could only preserve the true secrets of Sirius by emigrating in order to preserve it intact without contamination by some religious change. This could have happened during the reign of Akhenaten. We don't know. We'll never know. But this seems to have been the motivation. And in ancient Egypt, the star Sirius was of fundamental importance and was identified with the goddess whose name was Isis. And the rising of Sirius, which is an astronomical phenomenon, was New Year's Day for the Egyptians. Their calendar, their sacred calendar, was based entirely upon the star Sirius, not on the sun and the moon. Of course, they had solar and lunar calendars as well, as the Dogon do. The Dogon even have a Venus calendar. They've got 4 calendars. And all of this information seems to have been brought from ancient Egypt. So if you're wondering where did the extraterrestrials land, there's your answer.
Well, and it makes you wonder then about the true significance of the pyramids, for example, if things occurred in that area a long, long time ago.
That's true, and this gets us into many other issues, but I'm not the shy type, so I have attempted to tackle this. But as you notice, George, I'm so bashful, I can barely bring myself to speak to you.
I like you, Mr. Temple.
I like you too, George, even though we're on opposite sides of the ocean. But people will talk if we go on like this.
Well, let me tell you, though, I could talk to you for hours. As long as this program is, believe it or not, 3 hours with you, this is something that we could talk about for the next 50 years. It is just fascinating. Did the tribe ever leave behind any, when you're talking about hieroglyphics, did they leave behind any symbols or drawings of what they said or believed these extraterrestrials to be, or their craft?
Yes, many. And a lot of this is reproduced in my book. First of all, they do very detailed sand drawings of the orbital situation of the Sirius system, showing the planets and the stars, and all the orbits, by the way, are elliptical, not circular, so they've got that right. And they also do pictures of the beings who they say were aquatic. And they give very, very precise physical descriptions of them. They were air-breathing, but aquatic. So they were a bit like dolphins or whales, but they were a bit larger than humans, but not that much larger. And they had fish tails, but they weren't fish, because, fish don't breathe air. They've got gills. So these are more like dolphin creatures.
Now, how did they get here?
Well, the Dogon describe this in the most intriguing way. First of all, they describe their landing vehicles, which are descriptions precisely like landing vehicles that we would have to land on the moon or Mars today. That is, with the roaring sound and raising the dust and the fire coming out of the bottom, which goes out after it lands, and all of that, which would be your standard everyday landing craft, which I suppose even very futuristic space explorers would still use to come down and land on a planet with an atmosphere, a normal rocket sort of arrangement. But they say that when these beings, who they call the Nommo, first appeared, there was a new star appeared in the sky, and they appear to describe a geosynchronous orbit because it remained in place. They call it the star of the 10th moon. And then when the Nommo left, that star disappeared. So this appears to be a mothership in geosynchronous orbit during the course of the visitation that they are describing. And then from that, they would have disembarked in these landing craft, and they describe and do drawings of the landing craft and show all the fire and smoke and everything.
All right, now, if they look dolphin-like, did they have arms, and how did they move around?
Well, the arms are described as being without elbows, in other words, they were more flexible than our arms, and they breathed through breathing holes in the area of what we call the breastbone or the clavicles. And it's amazing how precise the descriptions are, really. And they're described also as being a bit repulsive. And so I found many ancient traditions of the Babylonians and the Greeks and the Chinese, all claiming that civilization was established on Earth by disgusting, slimy, aquatic beings with snaky or fishy tails. And all of this is presented in the Sirius Mystery at a very great length. And in the revised edition of 1998, I added all the Chinese and Greek material, which I hadn't included in the original edition, where I concentrated on the Babylonian and Sumerian traditions. But when you look around at the very earliest accounts all over the ancient world, really you find the same thing everywhere, that civilization was established by these weird aquatic fishy beings. In China, they're known as Fuxi and Yugua. In ancient Greece, Athens was founded by a being called Kekrops, who was one of these creatures. And according to the Sumerians and Babylonians, a being known by the Greek translation of his name as Oannes, founded civilization, and the Babylonian and Assyrian temples were full of gigantic statues of these beings with all the fish tails, and they were the culture heroes who created civilization on Earth. And this is the almost unanimous testimony of ancient times, but it's all been largely ignored, or at least until I started calling attention to it, and how this agrees with the very specific account of this amazing African tribe, the Dogon. So we've got a real story here, George.
Oh, it's a great story. It is. I'm in awe over this. Why didn't they make us in their image? If they were going to come down here and genetically play around with whatever beings might have been on the planet at the time, how come we don't look like they do?
Well, I don't make any claim for them genetically playing around with us.
Okay.
I only, in other words, I present my whole thing as a hypothesis based on the information I've discovered. I don't insist that it's true, although I personally think that it is. But I don't insist upon that. It
sounds like something happened. I don't know exactly what it is, and your theory is as good as any other, and there aren't any other out there. But something happened with this tribe. There's no doubt in my mind about that.
Well, there are many strange and wholly bizarre aspects of this, which are even stranger than what we've discussed. And over the 30 years since I originally published this book, it's actually 30 years ago that the first version of it appeared, and I spent 9 years writing it. I've spent most of my life heavily preoccupied every day thinking about what this all means. And the more I think about it, and all these years later, I've got to say this, the stranger it gets, because there are so many disturbing aspects of it that aren't immediately apparent. You see, the story is so bizarre that it's easy to get carried away by your first impression of it and your second impression and your third impression. But when you've been thinking about it for 39 years, as I have, well, then you get your 100 millionth impression, and the further you go on thinking about it, the implications become just really so bizarre that it would take another book to describe those, and I haven't written it.
Why do you think they left?
Well, that's part of what I'm referring to. Why did they leave? Or did they? If you think about the logistics of physical space travel, you're heavily restricted, and assuming you're capable of it in the first place.
At least the way we think of propulsion.
Well, pardon?
At least the way we think of propulsion right now.
Yes. If you're talking about physical space travel, that is transporting your actual physical body over interstellar distances, you're totally limited to one-way journeys. And the only way it would be possible is you would have to go into suspended animation, like you call it the deep freeze.
Mm-hmm.
So, and then you'd wake up when you got there. You'd be revived.
Or stumble into a portal. Maybe there's some kind of tunnel that they throughout the universe that they can transport time and space. Maybe they found something like that.
Well, yes. In fact, in the new edition of the Sirius Mystery, I give all the evidence, which leads me to believe that the solar system of our Earth and our Sun, and the system of Sirius, which is 8.7 light years away, are part of a greater system, which I call the Anubis cell, named in honor of the Egyptian dog-headed god, which is all part of my account of the Egyptian mythology, and Sirius being the dog star. And so I point out that the systems are linked by various means to do with numerical astrophysical quantities and natural constants in such a way that I think that we should look upon our sun's system and the Sirius system as being astronomically linked as a subunit of the galaxy, and therefore travel between them would be easier than it would normally be between just any old star and any old other star. After all, we are very near neighbors. But I still think that the physical transportation of physical bodies would probably have to go through this suspended animation phase. And so when you asked about why did they leave, and I said, well, maybe they didn't, what I really meant by that was that they probably retreated to the outer edge of our own solar system, parked their vehicle there, and went back into hibernation. Because I'm talking about a visitation that was thousands of years ago, and therefore they would never have gone home. That's the point. The Dogon imply this when they say that they will return, and when they do, it will be called the Day of the Fish, and they will rule from the waters, as they put it. So that has political implications and is what the spooks would call the ultimate security issue.
Absolutely. And we are talking about rising sea levels now, too, aren't we?
Room for more of them.
Exactly. Is it possible that the dolphins of today that are on this planet might be descendants of these beings in some form or fashion?
I wouldn't say descendants, but I would think that the dolphins would be like the pets of these guys.
That's interesting.
Like we have dogs, because I'm a great dog lover. I think dogs are nicer than people, and so if you were an Omo, you'd be just as fond of your pet dolphin as I was of my dog before she died.
And you were saying that this story basically is throughout China and other regions of this planet as well.
Yes, and I publish all the pictures, and you see, I've spent many years going to China, and I've written a book called The Genius of China, which is actually part of the Chinese secondary school curriculum, and I'm a visiting professor over there and all that. And so I'm fairly up on my Chinese things, and I've put all of that evidence in there. It's very important to realize that the Chinese, although they were pretty much isolated from the Western traditions, also maintained that civilization was founded by aquatic beings. And they draw pictures of them, and I reproduce these.
That is fascinating. And I would assume the stories somehow echo the Dogon tribe?
Completely, yeah.
Yeah, that's something. That is amazing. It's an incredible story, and I've been wanting to talk with you about that for the last 100 years, I think. And I'm glad we got you on that. Next hour, Robert, we're going to devote our time to the oracles of the dead. An equally stunning story. But in this case, you're there going through some of these tunnels, which you'll explain next hour, what you believe they might be, and how I think modern-day religions have somehow taken what might have been in Greek mythology or Greek episodes and have kind of turned it into something very interesting about Hades and hell. I found that correlation pretty fascinating myself. The work into Oracles of the Dead, how long did it take you to do this one?
Well, in a way, Oracles of the Dead is a very direct outgrowth of the Sirius Mystery, which had a lot in it about oracles, but I decided to go much deeper into it. And when I did, I discovered really, really strange things. Everything I do seems to be strange, George, including talking to you, by the way.
You don't do a lot of these lengthy interviews, do you?
Well, if I were asked.
Well, I got to tell you, though, there's pictures of you going down some of those tunnels, and you could not pay me to do that.
Well, if you have claustrophobia, you'd have a problem. I was crawling through tunnels which are only 18 inches high, for hundreds of feet, and it's a bit challenging, but you have to, take a deep breath. Well, in fact, it's difficult to take a deep breath because there's no oxygen down there. That's the other thing. You sort of are in danger of passing out. It's actually pretty dangerous.
I could not do that. Stay with us, Robert. We'll be back with you in just a moment. As I mentioned, his website is linked up at coasttocoastam.com. It's robert-temple.com. And when we come right back, we're going to talk about his latest work, equally fascinating, called Oracles of the Dead. I'm George Norrie, back in a moment on Coast to Coast AM.